Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of How I Record My Podcast. And in this episode, we'll actually go through a recording and then how I process the audio up to the point where I do the last step in the audio processing. I want to say thanks to my friend Jennifer, who was kind enough to spend some time with me doing the role of being a guest on the show. And this is just a very short version of how I would do a podcast, just so that we can use this for the purpose of showing you how I process. So here is the first part where we actually do the recording with Jennifer.
Take two.
Right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Jennifer to the show. Jennifer, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing, Scott?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for taking some time to come on and help me with this demonstration.
No problem.
So how have you been keeping yourself busy during the quarantine? Because you're a teacher, so you've been having to work a little bit remote, but your school year is wrapping up now.
It is. I was doing remote learning for about a month, and so I got adjusted and adapted to that. And I was playing my keyboard. I even played it over Zoom for a couple people, and working and going to school. So quite busy.
That's really cool. I would imagine doing a live performance is fun.
It was. I did manage to embarrass myself a little bit, though.
Well, yeah, but that's part of it, right? I mean, if you can't laugh at yourself, then we all have an issue.
That's true.
So have you been out doing any hiking during this at all?
I have, and actually quite a bit, a little more often than normal. So we got a couple parks by the house, and I go out around sundown and just hike, and I've been up to Prescott a couple times too.
Oh, it's just beautiful up there.
It is.
Yeah, we have a lot of parks here, but of course, much like you, we're heading towards that time of the year where even at night, you don't want to go out and do anything. You have to get up kind of early and get it done as the sun rises.
Yeah, that's true. Or even at sunset also.
Yeah, I find here that at sunset, it's a lot hotter than it is at sunrise. And even though that's when I go on my walks, I find myself less motivated to actually get up and do anything.
Yeah, I could see that. Are you still doing your walks?
Not right now, because the strip is mostly blocked off. There's really no place to park. I could probably Uber out there, but then I'm Ubering. So
Right.
everything's still kind of up in the air as to what's safe and not to do at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out to come and help me with the demo. We'll keep in touch and talk soon.
All right. Take care, Scott.
Thank you, Jennifer. So that's how the process goes when I actually record the podcast, which is pretty cool. And then now I'm going to show you what happens as I process the audio for the podcast. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to turn off the recording enabled, because I'm not going to be recording anything else on the show. I do the intro and the outro separately on a separate template. So we'll get to that in a later episode of this tutorial. But for now, this is the first part. So I tend to just go ahead and mute all the tracks except the one that I want to work with. And I will go ahead and take care of my guest first. I take their track off of mute. And the first thing that I do is, just to get a little bit more volume, I will process a -4 normalization, so that I get a little bit louder of a volume to work with in processing. If I process too quietly, I'll miss out on some of the audio artifacts, and they won't be removed, and then I'll have to do a whole nother process. So it's easier to just give me a little bit more volume than I record in at. So I just go ahead and use -4. And as you can see, the waveform got much larger. So now we have a little bit more to work with. So the first process that I run is the vocal writer from Waves. Now, as I'm recording this video today, these are the current plugins that I'm using to record it. That could totally change tomorrow, because one new plugin came out and somebody said, hey, you should try this. And I'll try it and I'll be like, oh my God, that's the greatest thing in the world. And maybe it will be, and maybe it won't. But in the meantime, this is currently the process that I'm using. So as I bring in the vocal writer, I have a special smooth ride that I have set to this, where you can see is a very short gap in how much I am willing to have a span in the volume of the audio. I want it to be fairly consistent, fairly smooth. And then I do a little bit of makeup gain here. not a whole lot because I can always renormalize it. Seeing as how the audio is going to be a little bit smoother, there's going to be less jumps in volume. It's easy to renormalize it and actually have it normalize the whole thing. So for the purpose of this, though, I'll just go ahead and run this process at this. All the other channels are muting. It's going to go from here on track 1 to here on track 2, where I have the next process ready to go. So for the purpose of this, in Sonar, or Cakewalk by BandLab is the current program I'm currently using to edit and record the podcast. We just go to tracks and then bounce to audio. And what we're going to do is we're basically just going to bounce the processed audio to the next track. So whatever DAW that you're using, however you go about processing your audio or processing your podcast, that's going to vary a little bit. For the purposes of Sonar, here is how we do it. And of course, I made the mistake that I make every single podcast, or just about every single podcast, is I forgot to do it in mono. Some lessons I just, for some reason, can't learn. So I can do one of two things. I could highlight that track and convert it to mono, or which is fine. I mean, you can do that, but here's the reason that I'm not going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and set the track I want it to bounce to. And if I just convert it, then every single track I do is going to do the exact same thing. So if I just change it in the bounce process from stereo to mono, I'm going to get a mono track this time, but I'm also going to get a mono track on every subsequent effect bounce that I do. So let's do an apples to apples comparison here on what Vocal Writer did. So if we stretch this track to show the same amount that the other track shows, so from master to master, now we can see that it didn't really do a whole lot as far as this process of the audio. Some it does a lot and some it doesn't. It really just depends. But in this case, it actually didn't change a whole lot, which is fine. What we're going to do now is we're just going to go ahead and shut that plugin off because we don't need it to do anything. We don't need that track anymore, but we're going to hang on to it for a minute. I always save in between so that, I don't have to redo whatever it was that I just did again. So now our next EQ that we're going to process is one that's exclusive to Sonar or Cakewalk by BandLab, as far as I know. And it's really if you've only grandfathered in earlier versions of Sonar. There's a long process on what you have to do to reinstall everything to get all your plugins back if you were a previous Sonar user, to convert it over to the new Cakewalk by BandLab, since BandLab bought Gibson, who was the previous owner of Cakewalk, or they bought certain elements of it, I should say, and done a hell of a job with it. Seriously, they've really done some amazing work. So this particular compressor is really to Cakewalk by BandLab itself, or Sonar in previous versions, but you'll be able to get the basic idea. So I've created, there was a preset called Vocal Soft, which I really liked. It was just a very gentle compression on the vocal. And I find it to be very helpful. So you can kind of get a look at the parameters that are set for it. Really, it's something that you're going to have to play around with because it's going to depend on how the recording was done on your end, what the end result is that you want. So my parameters aren't necessarily going to be exactly what you're looking at, but it could be similar. So here's the way that I have it set currently. And what we're going to do is we're now going to take this track that we've set the compressor on as an effect, and we're going to bounce it now to the next track. And again, had I done this previously, then I would have to rerun it once again to process the mono part. So that's why I changed that. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to bounce the track, and we're going to go to guest stage 3 because now this is the third set of audio that we'll have for it. And you can see that it's kind of doing its thing. And now we do have a little bit of difference. So if we compare master to master again, now we are looking at somewhat of a difference in the way that it processed the audio. A lot of times I will get difference on the first one when I use the Waves Vocal Writer, but in this particular case I didn't. But here you can see the audio is a little bit more compressed. And if I were to play it for you, it would sound basically the same, but it's going to be a little bit more even in volume, a little bit easier to manage when we get to later steps of the audio processing. Now, the third step that I'm going to show you will actually be how I run the Audionamics plugin Instant Dialogue Cleaner, which is a huge, huge, huge part of how I do the podcast. I'm going to actually do an entirely separate video on this. But for the basis of just moving along on how I edit the show, I'm just going to go ahead and not do this part of the process right now. We'll get to that in a minute, or in the next video, I should say. But for now, I'm also going to go ahead and run the processes that I run on my vocal as well. So again, we want to go ahead and we want to mute. We probably don't need the first two tracks from the guest, but I'm going to leave them for now. I always leave them for backup. So now that we're on to my recording of my track of my interview with Jennifer, the first thing I'm going to do again is normalize it to -4 degrees. You can see the massive difference that it makes in the overall volume of it. And so here I would normally also drag Instant Dialogue Cleaner down and run that as well. This one I'm going to run at the same time that I run Wave's sibilance program, which is a very, very great evener for taking out a little bit of de-essing and some of those harder C and S sounds. So for this one, I have I've used the voiceover setting. It's a great template. When you first pull it up, it really kind of gives me what I need for this. So I haven't even had to tweak it at all. It just works kind of right out of the box. So normally I would run that and I would drag down the Instant Dialogue Cleaner and I would set that as I would for recording. Again, not going to do that for the purpose of this video because we're going to do a separate video for Instant Dialogue Cleaner and what it can do for you. Actually, you know what? I am going to go ahead and do it just really quick. Just because we're actually going to need it for the recording. Just going to give it a generic setting for right now. But basically this sibilance is what we're looking for. So this one now, I'm going to go ahead and bounce this track down to the final, me final, I should say, as that's what I call it. And you're going to be able to see a little bit of how the sibilance works. Where the middle line that you see here is the audio. The top line is where it's actually making changes. Sort of like if you're running a compressor, by how much it's compressing it, or a normalizer or anything like that. Does take a little bit longer to run, and especially because I'm running IDC at the same time, it's going to take a little bit longer. But as you can see, we're now given a whole new track. And doing an apples to apples comparison, it actually did make it a little bit louder. And that's pretty typical. So that's how I process the audio. We're going to go ahead and skip to now. What I do then is I go ahead and mute this track. I take these effects off because I don't need them anymore. I hang on to them only because I may need to reprocess something at some point. But for the purpose of what we're doing now, I probably won't. But sometimes if something doesn't take exactly the way I want it to, I may have to adjust some parameters and rerun it a little bit. So anything that I don't need, I turn off. It's anything that doesn't need to be running in the background or just even be available to where it may affect something else. I have had that happen in the past, which is why I developed this strategy. So for now, what we're mainly going to be looking at now is the final mix for my vocal, and then also the final mix for Jennifer's as well. And you know what? Since we're going to need it for the final process, I'm going to go ahead and run that last process of Instant Dialogue Cleaner. I'm just going to run it as a process and not show you guys how I, again, would specifically change it, because we're going to get to that in the next video where it's going to make a lot more sense. But for now, let's go ahead and bounce this track from Jennifer's stage 3 to now Jennifer's final, or guest final, I should say. So this is now running the Instant Dialogue Cleaner, so that when we go to edit, I find it's much easier to edit clean audio than it is to edit audio that has been that is dirty, because you may make different editing decisions, or you may spend time trying to clean things up that you don't need to, because the effects are going to take care of that for you. So it seems a little bit ludicrous to spend the time doing that if you don't really need to. So that's it for this video. In video 3, we're going to walk through the IDC, or Instant Dialogue Cleaner process. I have said many times on the show, in public forums, I will not do a podcast without Audionamics' Instant Dialogue Cleaner, and you're going to see why when we get to the next video. Cheers.